There exists a paradox at the heart of the INTJ experience that few outside this personality type truly understand. The paradox is this: the very cognitive architecture that gives INTJs their remarkable capacity for insight, strategic thinking, and systemic understanding is the same architecture that isolates them from the majority of human connection. This isn't about social awkwardness that can be overcome with better communication skills. This isn't about introversion that can be managed with proper energy boundaries. This is something far more fundamental, a structural reality of how the INTJ mind operates that creates an unbridgeable gap between their perception and the perception of those around them. The more deeply an INTJ develops their natural cognitive strengths, the more isolated they become. The more accurately they perceive systemic truths, the more they are dismissed as negative or overthinking. The more their intelligence refines, the fewer people can meet them at that level of complexity. Intelligence doesn't lead to integration for the INTJ, it leads to exile. Arthur Schopenhauer, the 19th century philosopher who himself exhibited the hallmarks of an INTJ mind, recognized this pattern with brutal clarity. He wrote that a high degree of intellect tends to make a man unsocial, not because intelligent people lack social desire, but because the very nature of advanced cognition separates them from collective consciousness. Today, we're exploring why intelligence creates isolation for the INTJ, not as a personal failing, but as an inevitable consequence of cognitive architecture that operates at frequencies most people cannot access. To understand why intelligence isolates the INTJ, one must first understand how their mind actually functions. The INTJ operates through a specific hierarchy of cognitive processes that fundamentally differs from how the majority of personality types engage with reality. The INTJ's dominant function is introverted intuition, a cognitive process that perceives patterns, synthesizes complex systems, and projects future implications through largely unconscious processing. When an INTJ encounters information, their mind doesn't just register the surface data, it automatically maps that information against existing knowledge frameworks, identifies underlying patterns, recognizes systemic connections, and projects long-term consequences. This happens involuntarily, constantly, and at speeds that bypass conscious analysis. Their auxiliary function, extraverted thinking, organizes this intuitive perception into logical structures and efficient systems. TE demands coherence, values effectiveness, and seeks to optimize processes through rational analysis. When NI and TE work together, they create a cognitive powerhouse that excels at strategic planning, systemic problem-solving, and identifying inefficiencies that others miss entirely. But here's where the isolation begins. The INTJ's tertiary function is introverted feeling, their internal value system, and emotional processing. FI operates privately, focused on personal authenticity and internal alignment rather than external emotional harmony. Most critically, the INTJ has no extroverted feeling in their primary function stack. They don't naturally track others' emotional states, don't automatically prioritize social harmony, and don't instinctively soften their observations for emotional palatability. This cognitive architecture creates a mind that perceives deeply, analyzes ruthlessly, and communicates directly, precisely the combination that society finds threatening. When an INTJ enters a conversation, meeting, or relationship, something remarkable happens beneath the surface of social interaction. The INTJ doesn't just engage with ideas, they unintentionally hold up a mirror that reflects back patterns others would prefer not to see. And humans, as research in social neuroscience has demonstrated, react to intellectual mirrors very differently than they react to other forms of comparison. When someone encounters another person who is physically stronger, they might feel admiration or even inspiration. When they meet someone wealthier, they might experience envy, but not necessarily threat to their core identity. But when someone encounters another person whose intelligence reveals the limitations of their own thinking, something far more primal activates. Mirror neurons, specialized brain cells that fire both when performing an action and when observing others perform that action, play a crucial role in social cognition and empathy. These neurons allow humans to simulate others' experiences internally, creating the foundation for social understanding. But this same mirror system creates vulnerability when it reflects intellectual inadequacy rather than shared experience. When an INTJ analyzes a situation and identifies problems that others haven't considered, when they project consequences that others haven't foreseen, when they recognize patterns that others have missed, the people around them experience something uncomfortable. They're not just hearing an alternative viewpoint, they're confronting evidence that someone else's cognitive processing has accessed layers of reality they didn't perceive. This triggers what psychologists call ego threat, the recognition that someone else's capabilities exceed one's own. And while humans can tolerate superiority in physical or financial domains, intellectual superiority strikes at something deeper. It suggests that the way they've been thinking about reality might be incomplete, that their confidence in their own judgment might be misplaced, that their understanding of situations might be shallow compared to someone who sees more clearly. The INTJ isn't trying to create this effect. They're simply operating from their natural cognitive architecture, NI perceiving patterns, TE organizing logically, delivering insights without the FE softening that would make those insights more socially digestible. But the impact remains the same. The INTJ becomes a mirror that reflects others' cognitive limitations, and rather than thanking the mirror, people typically respond by dismissing, avoiding, or attacking the messenger. Schopenhauer identified something crucial about human psychology that explains why INTJs face chronic social rejection despite, or rather because of, their intellectual capabilities. He recognized that humans operate primarily through what he called the will to life, a fundamental drive oriented not toward truth, but toward comfort, survival, and the minimization of cognitive dissonance. Most people, Schopenhauer observed, don't actually seek truth. They seek validation of their existing beliefs. They don't want their comfortable assumptions challenged. They don't want to confront the complexity that lies beneath their simplified understanding of reality. The INTJ operates from the opposite impulse. Their NITE architecture drives them toward what might be called the will to truth, an almost compulsive need to understand reality accurately, even when that understanding is uncomfortable. The INTJ cannot unsee patterns once recognized, cannot ignore logical inconsistencies once detected, cannot pretend systemic problems don't exist once understood. Their cognitive architecture literally prevents comfortable ignorance. This creates an inevitable collision. The majority operates from a comfort hierarchy where social harmony and emotional ease rank higher than intellectual accuracy. The INTJ operates from a truth hierarchy where logical coherence and systemic understanding rank higher than social comfort. When these hierarchies interact, conflict is structurally guaranteed. Consider what happens in a typical workplace meeting. A team is planning a project using an approach that the INTJ's pattern recognition immediately identifies as flawed. The INTJ's NI has already projected the likely failure points. Their TE has already analyzed the inefficiencies. When they speak, they deliver this analysis directly. This approach won't work because, followed by logical reasoning. To the INTJ, this is helpful. They're preventing foreseeable problems. They're optimizing the approach. They're serving the truth hierarchy, accuracy over comfort. But to others in the meeting, this feels like an attack. The INTJ has just told them, implicitly, that they didn't think deeply enough, that they missed obvious problems, that their judgment was insufficient. The comfort hierarchy has been violated. The group faces a choice: acknowledge that the INTJ is right, which requires admitting their initial approach was flawed, or dismiss the INTJ as negative, overthinking, or not a team player. The comfort hierarchy predicts which option most groups choose. This pattern repeats throughout the INTJ's life. They identify problems before others see them. They're dismissed as pessimistic. Events unfold exactly as the INTJ predicted. No one acknowledges this. The cycle continues. And with each iteration, the INTJ learns that their intelligence doesn't create connection, it creates isolation. History offers a sobering pattern for INTJs who wonder whether their experience of intellectual isolation is unique to them. It isn't. Throughout recorded history, individuals who saw further than their contemporaries faced remarkably consistent responses: dismissal, ridicule, persecution, and only retrospective validation after the damage was done. Galileo understood that the Earth revolved around the Sun decades before the collective consciousness could accept this truth. His accurate perception didn't earn him respect, it earned him house arrest and the threat of torture. His crime wasn't being wrong. His crime was being right before society was ready to acknowledge what his intelligence had revealed. Nikola Tesla envisioned wireless communication and alternating current systems that would power the modern world. His insights were so far ahead of his era's understanding that he died in poverty, dismissed as impractical and eccentric. Only decades later did society recognize that his impractical visions had been accurate projections of technological inevitability. Alan Turing's intelligence broke the Enigma code and potentially shortened World War II by years. His reward was chemical castration for being gay and social exile despite his contributions. His crime, again, wasn't intellectual inadequacy. It was possessing intelligence that operated beyond societal norms in ways that made others uncomfortable. These weren't just smart people. These were individuals exhibiting the classic INTJ cognitive pattern: NI perceiving futures that others couldn't access, TE attempting to actualize those visions, IF holding to internal conviction despite external rejection, and inferior SE leaving them vulnerable to the immediate social consequences of their foresight. The pattern reveals something critical. The INTJ's intelligence doesn't just create isolation in their personal relationships, It creates existential isolation from their own era. The INTJ lives perpetually in a future that others haven't reached yet, seeing possibilities in problems that won't become obvious until years later. By the time the collective catches up to what the INTJ perceived, the INTJ has moved even further ahead. This is what Schopenhauer meant when he wrote that genius is essentially lonely, not because genius lacks social desire, but because the very nature of advanced cognition separates the individual from the collective timeline. The INTJ doesn't just think differently, they think dimensionally ahead. And there's no companionship in that space until others arrive, which they typically do only after the INTJ has already moved forward again. Here lies perhaps the deepest layer of the paradox. Society actually needs what the INTJ offers. The pattern recognition that identifies systemic problems before they become crises. The strategic thinking that maps paths through complexity. The willingness to speak uncomfortable truths that everyone else is avoiding. The refusal to accept inefficiency just because that's how it's always been done. Yet, the very qualities that make the INTJ valuable to systems are the same qualities that make them unbearable to individuals. NI perception reveals truths people aren't ready to acknowledge. TE organization exposes inefficiencies people have been tolerating. FI conviction refuses to compromise on principles for social ease. The INTJ becomes simultaneously invaluable and intolerable. This creates a strange social dynamic. Organizations seek out INTJs when facing complex problems that require strategic thinking. But those same organizations often marginalize those INTJs in normal operations because their persistent pattern recognition and systematic critique creates constant friction with the comfort hierarchy. The INTJ is called in to fix what's broken, then dismissed for pointing out what's still breaking. Valued for their intelligence in crisis, then excluded for that same intelligence during normalcy. Needed for what they see, then rejected for seeing it. Schopenhauer understood this contradiction at a societal level. He recognized that civilization advances through the vision of individuals who see beyond current limitations, yet those same individuals face persecution from the very civilization their vision serves. Progress requires people who can perceive what doesn't yet exist. But communities are built on shared current reality, not perceived future reality. The visionary serves the future while being rejected by the present. For the INTJ, this means their intelligence doesn't just create personal isolation, it creates a fundamental misalignment with the temporal orientation of their culture. They're solving tomorrow's problems while everyone else is managing today's comfort. They're building frameworks for systems that don't exist yet, while others are maintaining systems that already do. Understanding why intelligence creates isolation for the INTJ doesn't eliminate the isolation, but it does transform its meaning. This isn't personal failure. This isn't fixable through better social skills or forced extroversion. This is the structural consequence of cognitive architecture that operates at frequencies most others don't access. The question isn't how to make the INTJ more palatable to society. That would require diminishing the very cognitive functions that make them capable of the depth they achieve. The question is how the INTJ can maintain their intellectual integrity while accepting the isolation that integrity creates. First, validation of the experience itself matters. The INTJ isn't imagining the pattern of rejection. Research in personality psychology, social neuroscience, and historical biography all confirm the same reality. Advanced cognitive processing that reveals uncomfortable truths will face social rejection regardless of accuracy. The INTJ's repeated experience of being dismissed, called negative, or labeled as overthinking isn't evidence of their inadequacy, it's evidence that they're perceiving accurately in a context that prefers comfortable illusions. Second, strategic relationship selection becomes crucial. The INTJ cannot operate without intellectual companionship. Humans require connection even when that connection is rare. But the INTJ must accept that this companionship will not come from the majority. Finding even one or two people who can match their depth of analysis, who welcome pattern recognition rather than fearing it, who prioritize truth over comfort, this becomes essential. These relationships won't happen through casual social mixing. They require the INTJ to risk vulnerability by expressing their actual cognitive process rather than performing a socially acceptable version. And they require accepting that rejection from those who can't meet them at depth is simply data, not judgment. Third, reframing isolation as selection rather than rejection. Schopenhauer suggested that the person of intellect chooses solitude not because they dislike humanity, but because the quality of connection they require is so rare that solitude feels preferable to shallow interaction. The INTJ isn't being rejected by everyone. They're being filtered by cognitive compatibility. Only those who can operate at similar complexity remain. This reframing doesn't eliminate loneliness, but it removes the internalized shame that the INTJ might be doing something wrong by being themselves. Finally, accepting the role Schopenhauer described as the visionary's burden. The INTJ sees farther, thinks deeper, and recognizes patterns that won't become obvious until later. This creates isolation in the present, but it also creates possibility for contribution that others cannot make. The INTJ isn't broken for thinking this way. They're simply operating from cognitive architecture that serves long-term systemic needs rather than immediate social comfort.